Welcome and thank you for joining us today as we share the barriers that exist in organic oat supply chains in Canada and explore strategies to overcome these barriers. My name is Marla Carlson and I'm chair of the Organic Value Chain Advisory Committee, and I'm moderating today's webinar. COG's office is located on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. We recognize and honor the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across this land. We also acknowledge the historical and ongoing oppression of land, cultures, and Indigenous people in what we know as Canada today. As an initial step towards reconciliation, we encourage you to learn about the history of the land where you live. Please visit Whose Land. I'm calling in today from Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada, and I'm situated on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional home of the Nahiawak, the Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. So we're going to start with a little housekeeping just so everyone can get the best out of the webinar today. So if you can, you'll just see on the screen some instructions there for you. So we do have French language interpretation today. So on the bottom right hand of your screen, you will see an interpretation globe. Just click on that and choose your language preference. And if you have questions today, there's a Q&A function, and we would ask you to drop your questions into that function for us. And please ask questions as we're going along throughout the day, because then when we get to the end, to the question time, they're all queued up and ready to go. Also to let you know that today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available within 2 business days of the broadcast, and you can access it on COG's YouTube channel. We also would encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat, to connect with other participants and share your observations. We are also sending out a poll to learn about your relation to the organic oat sector. So that's just popped up on your screen. So we'll just wait 20 or 30 seconds and get everybody to fill that poll in for us. Just gives us a sense of who's in the virtual room. And it always seems like a long time, 20 or 30 seconds. Perfect. Oh, excellent. So we can just see up on your screen now that we mostly have producers and processors here with us today, and some distributors and nonprofit organizations. So thank you all for being here today, and I hope you get what you need from today's session. So moving on. So today we'll examine and discuss the challenges and opportunities within the Canadian organic oat supply chain. These findings are from the Canada Access Project, a 2-year initiative by the Canadian organic growers, and is managed by David Mazira-Goulet as project lead. You can connect with David in the chat. The project engaged stakeholders across the country to determine what barriers stand in the way of increasing production and sales of 6 organic crops or sectors. COG and their partners specifically examined organic carrots, beef, blueberries, salad greens, oats, and field peas. The Canadian Access Project is funded in part by the Government of Canada through the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canadian Agricultural Strategic Priorities Program. That's a mouthful. A $50.3 million 5-year investment to help the agricultural sector adapt and remain competitive. So joining us today, without further ado, why we're all here, to hear from Don Murray. Don is the senior consultant with Harry Cummings and Associates. Don will present the findings of their research and propose strategies to overcome barriers to overcome barriers. So over to you, Don.
Thanks, Marla. Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We walk through and talk about some of these issues and barriers that are sort of impacting supply chain and what we might do to remedy some of those barriers going forward. As a jump off point, I want to talk a bit about the research methods that we used in exploring and identifying what these barriers were. A key element of this was the involvement of stakeholders in organic oat production and or processing, distribution, value-added production and so on. So we initially set out by identifying these key informants with the assistance of the Organic Value Chain Advisory Committee that was made up of a body of individuals represented from across Canada who have worked with organizations in the organic sector. And they helped us populate a contact list of relevant stakeholders to reach out to engage as part of an interview process. We used those interviews to, again, explore and unpack the different sort of various supply chains and challenges that are being experienced in the different areas of the supply chain, talking with both producers and processors and other elements of the supply chain, including research as well. In that outreach to the stakeholders, we initially sort of reached out to 26 stakeholders in total across Canada. 13 of those stakeholders ultimately participated in an interview, and that group was made up of 8 producers, along with 2 large-scale oat miller processors, 2 smaller-scale value-added millers, and then 1 researcher. The 8 producers that we spoke to reflect a mix of different farm sizes. Several are farming on acreages of less than 1,000 acres, ranging from 200 to 600 acres. But there were several larger scale farms that are operating or farming more than 2,000 acres and upwards of 5,000 acres in one case. In terms of the actual organic oat production on those farm bases, again, this can sort of vary depending upon what's being produced in any given rotation year. But we were, for the purpose of the group that we spoke with, a number of farms are producing anywhere between 150 and 200 acres of organic oats. And there were several that are producing 500 acres or more in any given year. There was only one farmer that we spoke to that's actually producing under 100 acres of oats. Those 8 producers represent 5 different provinces: Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Quebec, and Prince Edward Island, were the provinces where those 8 producers hail from. And in addition to organic oats, of course, in the rotation, they were growing other crops. And those types of crops included peas, wheats, barley, rye, in some cases, lentils, oilseeds, even corn, and as well as cover crops like alfalfa and red clover are also being grown as part of some of the rotations. The large scale millers that we, or the large and the small scale millers that we spoke to are based in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and also have facilities in Manitoba. And then the 2 smaller scale ones are in BC and Ontario. So that was a key element of our research with that interview process. We also had observations that were provided by and through a panel of stakeholders that participated in the Eastern Ontario supply chain meetings that were conducted last year. And there was one of those supply chain panels that specifically focused on grains. So there were a number of participants that were either grain handlers, distributors, they were value-added bakeries, livestock feed mills were part of that panel, and again provided some relevant commentary and insights on supply chain barriers that are particularly relevant for this supply chain. There was also a national survey of organic sector stakeholders that COG conducted in partnership with the Canadian Organic Trade Association and the Organic Federation of Canada, again looking at important data gaps in the sector, and that involved a total of about 370 stakeholders actually responded to that survey, of which there were 200 producers who were involved in some form of crop production. Again, the survey itself didn't necessarily focus on organic oats, but there were many elements of the findings that served to reinforce and validate the themes that emerged through the key informant interviews that we conducted. Another quick piece here that was part of our sort of research was the Guelph Organic Conference Roundtable discussion on supply chain barriers. Again, this was an event that was held last year at the conference last year. And again, there were several panelists that shared their observations on the barriers they were experiencing directly or indirectly. And there were another 50 attendees who sat in on that conversation. And we had a number of polled survey questions that they responded to. And not a piece of data collection that was specifically targeting organic oat production, but it came up in the conversation. And again, the insights were relevant to and helped to validate or serve to validate many of the themes that we encountered in the interviews that we conducted. And then finally, we did a sort of a document review looking at literature and data and other sort of reports that were relevant to this, to the organic supply chain. So before we get into the barriers, let's have a look at the snapshot of organic oat production and sales in Canada. And even the bigger picture of what is total production of organic and non-organic oat production. So we know from data from Stats Canada that the total harvested oat area, organic and non-organic combined, fell by about 15% from 3.2 million acres in 2019 to about 2.7 million acres in 2020. And there was also a corresponding drop off in yield during that time by about almost a third. But the total harvested oat production in terms of quantity fell by about 43% from 4.5 million tons in 2019 to 2.6 million tons in 2020. When we look specifically at the organic oat production content, it's estimated that there were about 305,000 or almost 306,000 acres in production in 2020, which was up from 281,000 acres in 2019. Organic oats are being grown in every province. Producers are largely concentrated in 5 provinces: Saskatchewan, Alberta, Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba, with a good chunk of that, over 50%, being in Saskatchewan and Alberta. And the large majority of the area in production is concentrated in Saskatchewan, which has about 45% of the total acreage, Alberta with about a third of the acreage, and then Quebec at 9% and Manitoba at 6%, and then with the remaining provinces making up the balance of that area under production. The thing to keep in mind with the oats is that oats is often grown in combination with other crops. So this acreage that we're talking about here, the 305,735 acres, represents acreage where it might be oats exclusive or oats in combination with other crops. So it's an important context piece to keep in mind when we're thinking about that total acreage that number that's being represented there. So it is somewhat difficult to sort of accurately sort of estimate what the dedicated acreage to oats is as an exclusive crop. The certifying bodies sort of don't sort of necessarily report on their data the same way. So it's not something that we can sort of get an accurate number on. It does appear, though, that the most common combination crop that is being grown with oats is peas, but other crops have been reported, including barley, wheat, triticale, and rye, and that's for the organic component. The other thing we don't really have an accurate sort of estimate on is, what is that oats being used for in an end use, at least as producers are reporting their data. So is it being kept for seed? Is it being used for food grade oats? Is it going into livestock feed or a plow down crop? We don't know what the end use is based on the data that's provided by the certifying bodies. In terms of the organic oat farm gate value, again, this is something that we don't have an exact sort of figure on. However, we can project using a very rough estimate using production and price parameters prepared by government agencies. So for example, we know that the 2020 cost of organic production templates prepared by the Manitoba government used an average gross revenue of about $410 per acre for organic oats. And that's based on an average yield of about 82 bushels per acre and a price of $5 per bushel. I know that dollar value per bushel is perhaps a little on the low side, but again, it's a conservative value that we're using here. And so if we conservatively estimate that 75% of the organic oats produced in Canada in 2020 was harvested and sold off the farm, so that's about 75% of that 305,000 acres we talked about, and then we apply that return value of about $410 per acre for that production, then we would project that the total farm gate value of organic oats to be as high as 94 million. And again, we think that's a conservative value, but it gives us a sense of just how the size of the value of the organic oat production in Canada. There is a fair bit of amount of organic oats being exported. In 2020, the total value of certified organic oats amounted to 14.3 million, and this was up from 13.7 million in 2019 and 9.8 million in 2017, but down slightly from 15.4 million in 2018. And we also have a bit of retail sales data on oat products. We don't have something exclusive to oats, but we do have retail sales data on hot cereals. Hot cereals, including things like oatmeal, cream of wheat, cream of rice, and corn meal grits. Again, we don't have something in the sales data that's exclusive to oats, but again, it's oats sort of make up a substantial amount of the hot cereal market, and they're very popular, certainly in Canada. So we know that in 2020, the total retail sales of hot cereals, organic and non-organic combined, amounted to $188.6 million, of which the organic hot cereals accounted for about 10.5% of those sales, or almost $20 million. Again, I want to be careful to note that the sales data really does represent a partial profile, as only some retailers are making their data available. Right, so let's move on to some of the key barriers to supply chain development and corresponding strategies for the organic oat supply chain. Starting with the issue of the cost of transitioning to organic and the challenges associated with transitioning to organic, and issues that farmers are having with the performance and yield in some regions with growing organic oats. We've heard that transitioning to organic involves time and resources. It's a commitment to go out there and acquire and adopt new knowledge and practices related to organic production, and also to marketing, and including finding and securing marketing channels, right? And it's farmers are likely to experience reduced cash flow during the transition period, anywhere from 3 to 5 years. And there could also be corresponding lower yields before a premium price can be captured on that certified organic label. Farmers did certainly relay to us that there are a lot of upsides to growing oats. And maybe we'll talk a bit about that before we get into the issues that they're having in terms of with their performance and yield. But in terms on the plus side, why are oats attractive? Well, they have a variety of uses, right? So they can be used in food manufacturing. They can be used in livestock feed, be it a grain or a green feed product. And they can also be used as a green manure. Hulless oats in particular have a higher protein content versus regular oats, and are sometimes preferred by farmers and food processors for milling or livestock feed. Oats in general are viewed as a good organic crop because they grow aggressively and can outpace or smother weeds. And they're also viewed as a good rotation crop to include in regenerative farming, and generally can provide a reasonable return. As I mentioned earlier on, oats are often grown in combination with other crops like peas. And peas are good also for helping to choke out weeds. And we've heard that peas can do well in dry years, and oats will do well in wet years when they're grown in combination. So again, it gives you a bit more insurance when you've got a combination like that can handle varied weather situations. However, several stakeholders emphasize that oats must be managed well. And as with any organic cereal crop, it's important to appreciate small improvements in efficiencies that are gained in yield from year to year, and even from field to field. And really, it's important that farmers be resilient, and in the case of organic production, have that added level of stamina over and above the challenges that conventional farmers face and endure. We did indeed hear from some producers that have struggled to make organic oats work in their setting. They have found that the oats have not performed well, or are not yielded as well as other crops that are providing better returns like wheat, corn, and canola. They've encountered challenges with soil fertility, in some cases working on a land base where the nutrients have been overly depleted and they're struggling to get that nutrient profile back up. There are issues with disease like leaf and stem rust, and ongoing issues with wild oats, which are difficult to screen them out once they're in the crop without the right equipment, which can be inexpensive. Can be expensive to do that, or costly, especially if they have to ship those out to be screened and cleaned off site. There were a number of suggestions that there really needs to be more research around looking at ways to, one, reduce wild oats during the production stage, and also looking at affordable ways to screen them out when you get into the harvest stage, if they're already in the crop. One stakeholder observed that organic prices seem to have stagnated in general, and they're seeing some organic producers, in fact, moving back to conventional. One sort of stakeholder described the change in oat acreage as a battle for acres, observing that as much as 30,000 organic acres could be returning to conventional production. However, this particular stakeholder also feels that those that are leaving organic maybe should not have been on organic in the first place, and may not have been motivated to go into organic for the right reasons, thinking that they were probably there to go in for the initial profit, and perhaps not entirely committed to the organic philosophy. Indeed, some producers are feeling that this sort of drop off in production might be a positive development, as it could serve to tighten up the organic supply chain and bring the price back up somewhat. At least two stakeholders commented on the idea of this issue of it being somewhat costly to transition, that some form of compensation might be helpful to incentivize farmers to make that leap and go into organic. However, one miller shared a story with us where they sort of experimented with paying farmers a premium to help them through the transition period, with the expectation that this cost would be recovered by the mill, once they had sort of gotten their certification through a transition fee. But ultimately, they decided to drop that approach because it really felt like they were penalizing the producer at the time they achieved their certification. Another issue that came up was this the record keeping that's associated with organic production. Now, many of the producers we spoke with, in fact, actually found record keeping to be beneficial, and it's a valuable feature of the organic sector. Producers have commented that it's made them better farmers as they've become more detail oriented, and they're able to track their activities and even sort of see where their breakthroughs are coming out over time. But one producer did emphasize that it's important that if you've got hired staff or employees, that they also have to be dedicated to ensuring that the record keeping is accurate and complete, and really has to be internalized as part of their job responsibility. Another producer emphasized that it's important for certifying bodies to ensure that they have knowledgeable inspectors that have a strong grasp of their responsibilities and are familiar with farm practices and are in touch with the realities of production. It was further suggested that certifying bodies could and should play an expanded role in providing mentoring, training, and guidance to producers, such as hosting field days. Several producers commented on the loss of our government-supported rural extension services and field research stations that provided valuable service in testing seed varieties and related crop management practices for local conditions. And sort of stepping into that vacuum, though, producers have also noted that they have found their organic community and/or provincial regional association to be helpful and willing to share information and best practices. But there are times when the information they're in need of just simply isn't available from those groups. And what's available from other sources like academic research stations or government may not be specific to their organic crop, relevant to their region, might be too technical, or in fact, just simply too costly. Interestingly, the two major grain millers that we spoke to in Western Canada, Grain Millers and Richardson's, have taken on a sort of a proactive role in providing various agronomy services, hosting field days, and conducting research on demonstration farms, and even sponsoring organic events. And And in a rare few cases, we found that there are some regions that are fortunate to have other organizations that have stepped into and carried on research and taking on an advisory role. For example, the Mackenzie Applied Research Association in Northern Alberta is potentially looking at research into rotation crops for oats over the next 5 years. And they're also looking at ways to maximize rotation crops. So typically in an organic oat rotation, in the region, the first year might be dedicated to oats, second year peas, third year wheat, and then a fallow in the fourth year. They're looking at whether there's some sort of another sort of an income generating crop can go into that fourth year, like millet, quinoa, and exploring about the viability of finding a crop that could fit in that fourth year of rotation. Also in the area of oat research with the Mackenzie Applied Research Association, they're sort of looking at focusing on oats for milling and the attributes related to milling quality, yield, and early rate of maturity. Another producer we spoke to indicated that they're getting good support from the University of Manitoba, as they have an organic specialist and stakeholders have established an informal group of organic farmers that share information. So there's sort of a bit of a hodgepodge of organizations and interest groups that are have filled that traditional role of government-supported rural extension, but it is sort of, we've been hearing that it's not well networked. Information is, where is it being compiled? How do we access this? How do we sort of transfer that information from one setting to another so that the most relevant part of that information are then applicable to another particular part of Canada? Those sort of things are still to be worked out, and some sort of support is needed to ensure that that flow of information continues and can be made accessible going forward. This issue of transitioning to organic was a significant challenge as identified both in the National Survey and in the Guelph Roundtable as part of those research elements. In terms of strategies, we really do think that we need to sort of continue to look at developing and strengthening these knowledge transfer points and ensuring that access is convenient and affordable. Information on transitioning to organic and ongoing advancements in production, processing, and marketing should be organized and consolidated for easy and efficient access. We need to continue to support collaboration between producer stakeholder agencies, certifying bodies, research institutions, and government to reinvest in extension services for the organic sector that are timely and relevant to local conditions and easy to access. And we also need to work with research institutions to address the challenges that intellectual property agreements pose, right? So that information isn't being bound up and held in corporate interest, and ensuring that information can be made accessible. Ensuring that the certification process is easy to navigate and efficient and consistent is a bit of a no-brainer, right? Where possible, try and reduce the paperwork. And also where possible, using online platforms. So allowing the documents to be updated annually with pre-populated data fields so that if a producer really isn't sort of modifying their practice in a major way, a lot of the information from the previous year is simply carried forward and is in the application without having the data to be re-entered. There's also an interest from stakeholders mentioned that we spoke to about the government's regulatory mechanisms needing to be reviewed and enhanced, right? So an interest in seeing greater political leadership in limiting and reducing the regulatory mechanisms that contribute to cost, right? And even looking at some sort of a government funding formula to support farmers in following and maintaining regulations that are put in place. A number of farmers talked about issues they've encountered in accessing and the affordability of organic inputs and infrastructure and/or equipment. In particular, that we had discussions about organic seed. The seed variety selection for organics is a key factor in producing high-yielding, high-quality oats. And different varieties will vary in the yield potential, the resistance to lodging, test weight, growth percentage, time to maturity, and so on, right? So there are a number of factors that have to be taken into consideration when choosing the oat variety at a local level, in terms of the local climate, soil type, disease pressure, and what the previous crops were in rotation. Several of the producers we spoke to confirmed that they're using conventional untreated seed. From their perspective, organic seed at this time is not at a price point where it's economical. They have found that it can be twice as much or more expensive than organic seed. And with the organic production systems, they're typically having to seed at a higher rate. In one case, someone indicating 2.5 to 3 bushels per acre. So the investment can be high for the organic oats when they're sourcing organically certified seed. One stakeholder noted that their preference is to use local seed that is adapted and known to perform well in local growing conditions. So a conventional type seed that is untreated. But again, for them, the importance is that this is already a proven seed that they will know, that will perform in their particular region. We do know that there have been organic certified seed that has been sort of grown in Canada and registered in Canada. So that seed is out there. But again, it seems as though that the price seems to be an issue that's still sort of causing concern for some producers. Some producers have been holding back part of their organic harvest for seeding, but they've also noted that they at times have shortfalls and they've had to rely on untreated conventional seed to replenish their seed stock. And typically producers are having to refresh their oat seed stock every 3 to 4 years before that yield drops off. And they need to move on to fresh stock. One stakeholder mentioned that there is considerable risk associated with growing organic seed. If the seed quality is not adequate or there are problems with weed content, it might have to go to a second market like a livestock feed. However, even those markets can be difficult to find, and there's the lower price associated with that secondary market. So we've heard from another producer in Eastern Canada that noted, they contract growers to typically produce organic seed for them, but they're hearing back from producers that want to produce more profitable, bankable crops, right? So ultimately, really, producers need to be assured that if they're producing organic seed, that they're going to get a good premium to make it worth their while to produce clean, quality oat seed.
Don, I'm just going to jump in and let you know there's about 15 minutes left in the presentation time.
Very good. Yep. On the sort of infrastructure side or equipment, we heard from several producers that emphasize the importance of having a dryer and on-farm storage. Unlike conventional producers that can burn off their crops with chemicals before harvest, organic producers typically face higher drying costs to bring that moisture content down. And it would be helpful if there was some form of additional funding available to support the investment in drying equipment and storage infrastructure. So in terms of a strategy, we really think that the sort of maybe looking again at this sort of opportunities for finding collaboration between the organic industry, research institutions, and government to look at developing and sustaining a domestic organic seed and research breeding program. Again, focusing on developing and sustaining research and a breeding program to ensure varieties are optimal for local growing conditions and resilient to disturbances like climate change. And again, also ensuring that organic seed is accessible to producers. Land affordability and availability. Many of the producers commented on how land values have increased significantly in the last 10 years and have made entry into farming or even expanding the existing land base prohibitive. We've been hearing land prices over the past 10 years from a producer in Eastern Canada noting they've gone up from $1,500 to $15,000 per acre. And even rental land prices are substantial now, ranging from $200 to $400 per acre. And if you're only getting $400 per acre on the oats, it really sort of drives you to look at other crops that are paying a higher return than oats. If you're already paying, you're more or less just breaking even after paying for rent. So several producers talked about how land values have gone up and have made it sort of, for them, prohibitive to sort of look at buying more land and expanding beyond what they're doing. An interesting approach by one producer in Western Canada was actually to do a land swap. So what they did was they did have land that was sort of in a different part, an area that they had to travel to. but they ultimately swapped that land with a neighboring farmer, and so that they were able to then sort of have that contiguous sort of piece of parcel, and it was easier for them to access. We also heard concern from producers about the growing sort of pattern of corporate type farms showing up and buying large swaths of land and limiting any opportunity for organic farmers to access land in any great quantity. And a couple of producers also commented on, even when they're coming in and buying these large swaths of land, not farming it themselves, but trying to rent it out at an excessive rental fee. So again, it's sort of land is being bound up by external interests and interfering with the ability of organic farmers, if they wanted to expand, just sort of taking on that added role. In terms of the strategy, partial strategy to address some of these issues on land affordability, it really comes down to sort of looking at matching programs as one sort of strategy to help organic producers find land to purchase and ensure that the service is offered in conjunction with other relevant business support services. So things like a farmer linking program where we're pairing new organic farmers with retiring organic farmers, enabling that farmer to sort of pass the farm on to a next generation, even if there are no family bonds. And that retiring farmer hopefully maybe also staying around to help mentor that young farmer as they're coming into the business. Also looking at some potentially cooperative farming examples where there's a group of young farmers starting together and gaining enough capital to buy or lease a farm that they can share. And even things like the farmland trusts, where a community or a conservancy group raises funds to purchase environmentally important and historic imperiled farms and then rent that land back to young farmers through long-term leases. We heard a number of concerns around climate change related challenges. There's an increasing observations around the increasing frequency of extreme weather events associated with climate, which is impacting production activities and cycles, and producers are having to adapt more quickly to changing conditions. Several producers in both Eastern and Western Canada confirm that they're experiencing successive years of heat and droughts, which has impacted yield. There have also been events of extreme rain events and flooding, which has resulted in challenges in harvesting in very muddy conditions and resulting in higher dry down costs for the grain. Several producers noted that they see regenerative farming approaches as a way to mitigate some of the severe impacts of climate change. And one producer really strongly advised that the organic sector needs to tap into this regenerative farming approach, or risk being left, the sector risks being left out of the conversation, right? So the organic sector, the feeling is that the organic sector needs to contribute to the conversation and possibly be a leader in the conversation on regenerative farming and how it aligns and supports with the organic approach. Another producer took this further, advocating that the regenerative approach needs to be formally integrated into the organic systems and certified alongside organic practices. And then finally, there was an observation on the regenerative push underway by private corporate sector interests. And they're coming into this in a big way with big names like General Mills, PepsiCo, and Microsoft and others investing in the promotion of regenerative farming. And there's a feeling that the involvement of the private sector will ultimately continue to advance regenerative practices faster than the government. We've also heard from the millers and the value-added processors that are interested in sourcing grains that are produced through regenerative production models, and they are looking at the value of regenerative approach and wanting to market this as part of their branding through their customer base. So from a strategy standpoint, we're sort of advocating that we support institutional research on climate resilient agriculture and ensure that research is relevant and accessible to producers. It's important that producers have access to and be informed about climate adaptation best practices. Important to build their knowledge base and confidence to understand climate change events and the appropriate practices. There's also an important role here for supporting the collaboration between all relevant stakeholders producers, research institutions, certifying bodies, and government to advance organic farming and regenerative farming practices. Another issue that came up was the limited local markets in some regions and distribution channels that are underdeveloped for the organic sector. This was more of an issue with, I would say, in Eastern Canada than Western Canada. In Western Canada, we heard that the producers are marketing their oats to buyers in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and BC. And generally, they weren't encountering too many issues in the amount of oats that those buyers in those provinces are taking. Producers really emphasized the importance of having a reliable, dependable buyer. And that without that infrastructure, growers might be less inclined to grow organic with buyers that are there to sort of take and pay for that product. And have mills that are supportive, as we talked before about grain millers and Richardson's being quite proactive in providing value-added services for producers, and even in providing trucking services if need be. In Eastern Canada, the issue of having a more limited local marketing options came up repeatedly. One producer, for example, in Quebec noted that there really are only 2 buyers in Quebec, and once they meet their supply needs, that market kind of dries up, and then they're forced to look at other markets in other provinces. But again, not always sure that those buyers are going to take what they have, and there's also the issue of transportation costs. Producer in Atlantic Canada noted that for them, they really need to have quality organic oats to make it they're worthwhile to trucking that out to get any sort of value added on the price. They also raised concerns about buyers and processors changing the quality specs and becoming a bit more demanding year to year, and that any deviation from the specs results in a reduced price or they won't take the grain. So it's becoming quite risky to commit to a contract when the quality specs are very, very narrowly defined. From a producer's perspective, it's difficult to sort of project what that harvest is going to look like in terms of quality, and a high risk that if it sort of deviates in any way, it's going to be rejected. And then it's having to fall back and finding an alternative market to sell into. So really around this piece around the limited local markets, it comes down to sort of facilitating and ensuring that we're supporting communication and networking between producers and buyers to identify marketing and distribution opportunities, including effective transportation linkages. Also ensuring that information is being made available to the processing and foods industry sector on the type of grain varieties that are being grown locally in the area, why the varieties are suited to the area, and their traits and qualities for value-added processing. And to some extent, where possible, encouraging processors to work with more varied quality standards, which sort of reflect the year-to-year variabilities in growing and harvesting conditions. It's very difficult to have equivalent quality from year to year and even from field to field. And many factors out of the hands or out of the control of organic producers need to be sort of taken into consideration when making decisions around the allowances around taking in the oats. There are certainly a number of growth opportunities that we're seeing with organic oats, growth in the oat-based food products. Producers are excited to see things like dairy substitute items sort of capturing the consumer interest. And one stakeholder in the milling industry believes that organic market is substantial and has room to grow, and that the COVID-19 sort of pandemic actually stimulated oat growth with consumer interest in baking and ongoing interest in oat-based products like oat milk. But noted there was an oversupply of organic oats in the past couple of years. The consumers wanted a cheaper conventional oats. Noted that organic oat quality has gotten better year to year, and they're seeing less dockage as producers improve production techniques, and we're getting better quality and better yield and cleaner crops through improved weed control. There's also interest in identity preserved oats. Producers and food processors are interested in identity preserved oats. They're produced right now in northern Alberta, have distinct quality traits for milling qualities, but we need to ensure that the handling and processing infrastructure can accommodate that product at a reasonable cost. I've also identified gluten-free oats there, but associated with that is the need for them to be produced under purity protocols, and there could be additional specs required by the processor. That might include specific crop rotation protocols, isolation protocols, and even third-party inspectors for those crops. There's also looking at getting at this value market opportunities for the oat screenings, right? That there's trying to make sure that we're maximizing returns on every element of the crop, and alternative markets for the for crops, and even the sort of screenings, and ensuring that we're capturing that in either through the organic livestock feed sector, the pet food sector, and so on. Finally, I want to sort of wrap up and talk about this this risk and threat and potential opportunity as it relates to the devaluation of the organic brand in the marketplace, right? With the proliferation of eco-friendly branding, that could result in market erosion for organic products, right? So there's a lot of alternative branding out there that appears to be aligned with organic, but clearly is not sort of strictly organic. And it really is important that we sort of look at ways that we can sort of promote full and truthful branding on food products that enable consumers to make informed choices, right? Producers in Western Canada stress that the COG and provincial organic organizations need to monitor and almost police organic marketing activity for fraudulent activity. There's an awareness that producers potentially are selling conventional as organic, and that buyers, brokers are potentially selling conventional as organic, and pointed to recent cases of this happening in the United States. If this isn't monitored and eliminated, then it will continue to sort of impact organic price and pull down the price because the supply of organic appears to be larger than it actually is. Another producer in Western Canada noted that consumer education is important. And it was done in the past, but it needs to continue. There's concern that other commercial interests are appropriating terms like naturally grown, grass-fed, and et cetera. And it's not sort of necessarily organic, but that sort of clever labeling is sort of getting in the way of capturing the consumer interest. There was also a sense that producers feel it's important that the organic sector needs to be the calm, rational voice, providing consumers with information to make informed decisions, and avoid getting into a battle of bashing conventional farmers with the messaging, right? There's a feeling that they want to focus on promoting the attributes and qualities of organic, and avoid being combative with the conventional sector on this. So really going forward, it's important to ensure that the marketing and promotion of certified organic products enables consumers to easily differentiate the organic product from the non-organic options. The resilience of organic farms and their ability to help mitigate climate change are important messages that need to be reinforced in marketing campaigns and to build on existing consumer loyalty. Producers will also emphasize the need for retailers to take on a greater role in promoting organic products and informing consumers about the benefits of organic farming. And also processors and producers, or producers in particular, need to look at creative ways to help retailers break out of their customary selling and pricing approaches to help consumers opt into organic options. For example, one producer we spoke to, not in the organic oats, but in another organic commodity or product, talked about allowing customers to pay a premium price if they wanted to support organic products as a way to sort of get them to buy in initially, that it was something not being forced on them, but ultimately maybe they would come around and think it and developing an attitude that it was the right thing to do. There's an important role for provincial and federal government agencies to monitor and regulate eco-friendly marketing claims to ensure that they are truthful and not misleading. One producer suggested that federal and provincial governments have have come a long way in supporting organic. And there's sort of a feeling, though, that the government sort of needs to continue to more and step up and protect core organic standards. For example, encouraging and enabling farmers to get the proper organic certification so that they don't feel they need to sort of use alternative or clever marketing to sell their product. So I've quickly wrapped that up because we wanted to sort of allow a bit more time for Q&A as part of these discussions. I have to say that with our previous presentations, we've almost maxed out on the full 60 minutes in my simply doing the presentation. So I kind of went through the final points here in a faster tempo, but hopefully that allows us for a bit more discussion here at the end, and we can take questions at this point.
Great, thanks, Don. We've been having a bit of a conversation in the chat function today, so you might want to just take a quick scroll through there. But some of the questions were around, are we seeing more imports this year, or what impact does imports have on on the Canadian market? Also, a question around using green manures to fix more nitrogen in the soil. Also talked about intercropping, and then the point being made around with your intercropping peas and yellow peas especially, and oats to do that nitrogen fixing, that the cleaning can be an issue at the other end, especially with any sort of chips or splits, because it's hard to to differentiate those in the cleaning process. And I've talked long enough for a question to come in, so that's good. What was the methodology in determining the $94 million farm gate value?
All right, so that was, I'll just go back to my notes there, because that was a, right, so I said we really had to sort of work off an approximation here because we didn't have farm gate sales data that was reported by producers. We did have a tabulation of the acreage area of organic oats based on what was provided by the different certifying bodies across Canada. So they tallied up that number of 305,735 acres in 2020, which was reported as organic oat acreage. We then had to work on or utilize or incorporate or integrate data provided by other sources to sort of say, okay, what would be an approximate yield on that acreage, and what would be an approximate return on that yield per acre. And so then it was sort of, in the particular data that are the numbers that I shared, we used a template that was prepared by the Manitoba government on cost of production. And they had used an average return of $410 per acre for organic oats based on an average yield of 82 bushels per acre and a price of $5 per bushel. We appreciate that is that $5 per bushel is probably on the conservative side. But again, it just gives us the lower sort of range of what we think the total value would be when we're using a conservative number. And even then, if we conservatively estimate that only 75% of those organic oats, that acreage that was produced in 2020, ultimately is harvested and sold off the farm, that amounts to 229,000 acres. And so then if we apply that 229,000 acres against the $410 per acre that are generated, that gives us that value of about 94 million.
Perfect, thanks. And the question came from Stuart McMillan, who did a presentation with Laura Telford at the MOA online conference this week, and he said he was just curious because of the presentation they did, and the number that you used is very similar to what they used in their presentation. So it's nice to have that consistency. And I always think
that's great to hear, because
yeah,
having other numbers validates, and maybe it was they may have reached that number by a very different means. And it's sort of like, even if you sort of come at this from different ways, we've got to be somewhere in the same area of what that value is. And that's good to hear.
Yeah. And maybe Stuart, you can share your presentation with Don. All right, and also we can't just we're coming up close to the top of the hour, so I'll ask if there is one more question out there, and I'll just wait a couple of seconds here to see if one comes in. But I just I can't not say something about data as we're having this conversation, which I think is pretty much a standard line in all reports coming out of organic research projects like this one, is that we are so data poor in the organic sector and are continuously using approximations to figure out some to figure these things out. And so always like to urge provincial and federal governments to help us out there and collect.
And it's also very much a moving target. We're talking year to year variability in growing conditions and decisions around what crops are going in and how the market is responding, and how we're seeing the bloom in market interest right now for organic oats, or oats in general, for oat milk. And I think you mentioned to me, Marla, at the start of this that some producers are potentially getting $10 to $15 a bushel for some. I think if I heard you correctly, for oats. And I'm thinking, well, that's we're using a $5 conservative estimate in sort of our, when we were projecting that 94 million. Yeah. So best case scenario, you can sort of think, well, $15 an acre. Why aren't we all growing oats?
Yeah, and also just to say that in the conversation we were having before the webinar, I was talking a bit about pricing, and also just to note that is the highest it's ever been, and is likely to level out. So your estimate is on the conservative side, but for a number of years was pretty spot on. Maybe so yeah. Just to also add that to that proviso to the pricing. Yeah,
and I think it's that way. It's sort of defendable. You can say that we have sort of not tried to sort of embellish the numbers here. We have really tried to sort of trim these out to say at a minimum it's got to be near these. This is the lower mark on it, the 94 million.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Oh, yes, Scott Shields from Grain Millers has just provided current pricing: old crop 15, new crop 10. Yes, likely to be closer to 5 than 15 most years. Thanks, Scott.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then there was just another comment that I'll just mention from Stuart saying we need more organic specific HS codes. The 14.3 million export is only whole oat grain, which is the smallest segment of organic exports. So, all right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Don, and everyone for participating. Oh, sorry. A correction. We're going to correct from Scott. He said should say not near 5, but likely 8 to 10 dollars a bushel is probably where we're going to level out at least in the coming year. So we'll just close up for today. Finish off by saying thank you to Don and for everybody in attendance and for your active participation in the chat today. It was really great to have that interaction and information from the participants. So this webinar is an important milestone for the project, and Canadian organic growers would like to thank Harry Cummings and Associates, the Canadian Organic Trade Association, and CASPP Organics, as well as the many producers and stakeholders for their important contributions. We also want to acknowledge our appreciation of financial support from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And our final webinar is coming up on February 25th, and Don is going to do a presentation on his findings for organic field peas. So if you've enjoyed today's webinar, please consider joining us on the 25th. And we're just going to pop up a final poll just to see if you would be interested in receiving a direct invitation to the upcoming webinar. So it's just popped up on our screen. And while you're filling that out, I just want to remind you that this webinar and all past webinars have been recorded, and they are available on COG's YouTube channel. And just to remind you which ones we've done so far, we've done organic carrots, beef, blueberries, and salad greens. So, and we've just had a post in the chat as well, so you can directly go onto the YouTube website from here. So thank you all again and have a great rest of your day.